Hey y'all, today we're going to be talking about the arms race. Okay, so we talked about how the Soviets and the Americans, they've been competing with each other. The Americans are trying to contain the spread of communism, and the Soviets are trying to spread communism. Well, one of the things that came out of this is this idea called the tech race, right? And it's broken up into two parts. The first is the arms race. Remember, an arms race is a type of militarism where both sides are trying to develop the strongest weapons they can. And the other is the space race to see who is the most technologically advanced. Okay, so let's start with the arms race. And this was a time where the Soviets and the Americans were competing to develop the strongest atomic weapons that they could. So it starts with atomic bombs, which are dropped out of planes. These slowly become stronger. The Soviets build some, the Americans build more, the Soviets want to build more, and so you can see how this kind of gets out of hand. After a while, they start developing new types of bombs. So the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a fission bomb, just a regular atomic bomb. But they eventually develop a way to fuse atoms together, which releases even more energy. These are known as hydrogen bombs. Okay, and so 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped by the Americans. That's when we talked about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in 1949, the Soviets joined the nuclear club as well. So you can see how this is now starting to get a little dangerous during the Cold War because both sides are competing with each other. So how an atomic weapon works, it's not just the explosion, but the explosion is a big part of it, right? That's the most dramatic part. So it's this huge fireball. It burns so hot that anything it touches vaporizes, okay? Next, you have the heat wave. And this is the hot air, basically, that shoots off of the fireball. And the air is so hot that it burns anything it touches. So buildings in the way can catch on fire, and this causes quite a bit of a destruction as well. And then you have the shock wave. This is the energy that is released from the explosion, and it can shoot out for tens of miles, hundreds of miles. The shock wave is quite strong, and this is going to knock over buildings. I want you to think about like a tornado, right? You know, the tornado itself, you don't want to get it in the tornado because that's the most destructive part, but it's throwing everything around from the wind. Think of that as the shock wave, or like when you throw a rock into a pond. The ripples, that's the shock wave. That's the energy that's being released by the nuclear bomb. But the scariest part, those who are lucky enough to survive the explosion, the heat wave, and the shock wave have to contend with radiation. And fallout is the radioactive material that mixes with the dust that gets shot up and disturbed by the nuclear bomb. Okay, and the wind can carry this hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of miles, depending on how big the bomb is. Okay, so radiation does a lot of things to our body. It prevents our cells from dividing properly, which can cause cancers. It can cause bleedings inside the organs. It's just some really nasty stuff, and people were terrified of this. Okay, so there was this idea during the Cold War called mutually assured destruction. And it's actually quite simple to understand. So if the Soviets were to launch a nuclear attack on the United States, as those missiles are heading our way, and Russia's quite far away, so it could take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour for those missiles to arrive. We can see them. We have the radar, and the Soviets did too. As we see those missiles coming, guess what we're going to do? We're going to launch our weapons as well. Okay, so even though the Soviets might have destroyed us with their nuclear weapons, well, we get to destroy them with ours as well. So the idea is that both nations are going to lose a nuclear war. Okay, one side can't just launch their nuclear weapons without the other noticing and get away with it. So there's a temptation to not, or there's an idea that we can't launch ours because we're going to get retaliated against, and they thought the same thing. This is mutually assured destruction. So basically said that if we're attacked, we're going to respond with an equal or greater force and totally destroy the other nation. Okay, so both the Soviets and the Americans subscribed to this train of thought, and this is really what prevented nuclear war from happening during the Cold War. The idea of nuclear weapons was never to actually use them, but to prevent other countries from using them against them. Okay, so the Soviets built their nuclear weapons so that the Americans wouldn't attack them, and vice versa. Okay, so things got really dicey during the 1960s. So during this arms buildup, in October of 1962, the United States discovers that the Soviet Union has put nuclear weapons in Cuba. So if you can see, Cuba's right here. It is very close to to Florida. It's quite close to Washington, D.C. So the Soviets had put missiles in Cuba, and the reason they did this was a guy named Fidel Castro. He was a communist in Cuba, and they overthrew the government in Cuba, and it became a communist country. So remember, the Soviet Union supports communism. They're trying to spread communism. They want to prevent the Americans from overthrowing the Cuban communist government. So they start putting their missiles here. All right, so the U.S. spy planes are flying over. They're taking pictures of this, and the Americans respond by saying, "Look, we're going to sink any ship, any Soviet ship that attempts to bring more materials to Cuba." Now, this is terrifying because if the Americans say this, they really have to back it up. As the Soviet ships, the Soviet Navy starts approaching, they have to make a choice. Are they going to fire on these Soviet ships? And if they do, how are the Russians going to respond? Are they going to start a war with the United States? That could turn into a hot war. It could turn into a nuclear war. Nobody wanted this. Okay, so this goes on for about 13 days. And eventually the Americans and the Soviets come to an agreement, and the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. Okay, so the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, and the Americans agreed to remove some of their missiles from the country of Turkey, which is right here. Okay, so notice how close Turkey is to Russia. This is Russia right up here. Okay, so both sides kind of got what they wanted, and nuclear war was avoided in 1962. Okay, so that's scary to think that the United States and the Soviets could have come to war over this, right? Because it would have turned into a nuclear war, and people were scared of that. Okay, so the second part of this tech race was the space race, and this was quite a bit more peaceful. And this was the race to see who could dominate space travel, right? And so the idea was who could get into space first. Okay, but the ultimate win, the big win, was getting a man on the moon. Think of it like a football game. You have 4 quarters, right? So the first thing is getting a person into space. Okay, and well, the Soviets managed to do that. They both put the first satellite into space. Okay, that was Sputnik. Okay, and so they launched the Sputnik satellite into space. It's a communication satellite, and so the Soviets actually got to space first. Okay, and so in 1957, the Americans say, "Okay, we gotta get this together. We can't have them dominating us in space." And so they start the Gemini program as a way to see if they could get the first person in space. Well, unfortunately, the Soviets put the first man in space. His name is Yuri Gagarin. Okay, and in 1961, the Soviets put him into space, and he returned safely. All right, but remember, the big goal was to put a man on the moon, and by 1961, the Americans managed to do that with the Apollo program, Apollo 11. Okay, so the Americans put the first person on the moon, and they won the space race. So even though the Cold War was about competing with the Soviet Union, okay, a lot of good things came out of the space race. Okay, so we get satellites, we get all sorts of microchips and things like that we use in our phone. So this competition to see who could be the best actually led to some pretty good things for us, right? I mean, we have our cell phones, we use them multiple times a day, and it's that satellite technology that allows us to use those effectively, and that all came from the space race, right? So today, what you're going to be doing in your Google Classroom, you have a arms race and space race activity. It's quite simple. It looks like a lot, but it's really not, y'all. So what you're going to do is embedded in these slides are links to videos. Okay, all of these videos are assigned to you in Discovery Ed. So remember, you go to your Wake ID, you go to Discovery Ed, and you click on Assignments. All right. So once you've done that, you can watch the videos, and this is going to give you more information about what you need to do. So you watch the video, and then read the directions for each slide. You're going to actually answer all your questions on these slides, right? Blah, 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 just like that. Okay? And so you just read and follow the prompt on each slide. And it's not too terribly hard. Okay? If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to reach out to me during my office hours, or you can email me. And if I need to get on Google Meet and walk you through it, I definitely can do that. Don't forget to also do your check-in for this lesson, which is also in Google Classroom.